Hello, and welcome to a new episode of the Good Ole Podcast. I'm Jackie Franchuli for Wahoo's 24/7. And as you can see, we're joined by the Sabres, Preston Willett. Preston, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, Jackie, anytime. Always good to be on.
Now, Preston and I will be breaking down what happened against Virginia and SMU, moving forward a little bit of what has to happen before. But before we get going, why don't you go ahead and like this video, like this channel on YouTube so we can continue growing the channel. And also go ahead and wherever you listen to your podcast, leave us a review as we continue to grow the podcast as well. And then head over to wahoos247.com for your full coverage of Virginia athletics, especially after Virginia football had a lot of official visitors on grounds and unofficial visitors. We got full reaction there on Wahoo's 24/7 as well. But Preston, not the performance that you wanted from Virginia, especially the offense, 1 week after the debacle at South Bend. I know, two top ranked teams, but at the same time, it felt like there was a lot missing from that offense.
Yeah, I said it, on my podcast, Who's on Podcast, the one word I could think of was lame. It's not a articulate word, but it just kind of summed it up the best because from the game plan and kind of how they attacked SMU, I think SMU is a great team, but I thought there was definitely an opportunity there. And going on the road to Notre Dame, that's tough. But I think at home against SMU, you should put up more of a fight than they did. And to be down, what was it, 20-0 at halftime, and then kind of, to kind of just not be in the game at all for the length of it, and then to not switch quarterbacks to try something new, and then to the kind of the reasoning after the game from Tony Elliott, all I could think of was kind of just lame. I expected a little bit more out of them, especially because I know Tony Elliott talked about it so much early in the week, and he talked about it post game that he really wanted this one for the seniors, but it just didn't seem like they did everything they could to kind of get this one for the seniors, like he said.
Yeah, I feel like there's like two factions right now from the fan base. And one is talking about how this is a ranked opponent, so you shouldn't expect more from the Cavaliers. But if you think about what's happened in the last 2 years, I mean, they competed against Miami at Miami. They competed against Louisville not only last year at Louisville with that controversial pass interference call towards the end of the game. And then you also had them, against Louisville at home as well, keeping it close. That's the game that they probably want back. And I mean, even Clemson that first quarter, they kept it tight. So, I mean, there's so many examples where Virginia kept within, reasonable expectations among these teams. It's just that we have not seen it. And to be fair, the defense did make both the Notre Dame game and this game, they kept them in the game. I mean, when you're dealing with Notre Dame, it was turnovers. In this game, they couldn't get any rhythm. I mean, Anthony Calandria didn't have time to throw the ball, but when he did throw the ball, there was no intermittent passing game. And that's been something that we've seen for the last few games, probably after that, like the first third of the season, right after probably that Louisville game, to be fair, probably around Trail Harris's injury. We haven't seen that intermediate passing game.
Yeah, and you also mentioned, it's a ranked opponent. SMU was just in a dogfight with Boston College the last week, and Virginia beat Boston College at home earlier this year. So yeah, it should have been closer. You could expect more. And with the way college football is, and you can look across the entire landscape from the ACC to the SEC and all over, like there's a lot more parity, and teams can do this if they come out and they play. You don't even have to play a perfect game. You just have to play, a good game, and you have to give effort. And you just got to try different things and weird things to try and get it. And it just didn't seem like they were willing to kind of throw everything at the wall to try and get this win. It kind of seemed early on like, all right, it's not going to happen today, guys.
Yeah, there was some decisions where, this season I felt like Tony Elliott was more willing to be more aggressive in some of his play calling. We saw that early on in the season, very compared to last year where I felt like they were more conservative. But then,
Yeah.
I sat next to you in the press box, and when they did go in the 4th and 1, I was like, why didn't you go with 4th and 1? But then they went with it in 4th and 6. So it was those calls that it didn't quite make sense when you look at the bigger picture. But yeah, it was, and then obviously the big call. And I feel like we need to talk about this before everyone's like, why aren't you talking about the quarterback question? I think I understood why you go with Anthony Calandria, right? Because at this point, you want to give him a chance. What Tony Elliott said in his post game press conference, and even on Tuesday, you want to give him a chance to respond. Totally understand. But when you say against Notre Dame that you wanted a spark, so you brought in Tony Muskett, you're obviously not having anything on offense. You had over less than 100 yards of offense in that first half, 97. Why don't you bring Tony Muskett in the second half, especially when Tony Elliott made it seem on Tuesday that he was going to have a battle coming into this game? But it didn't seem that Tony Muskett was in the game plan, to be honest, unless there was a huge turnover situation like Notre Dame. When you're Preston, you remember we were stalking Tony Muskett on the sidelines from the press box. We kept an eye on where his helmet was. And it never seemed like he was, ready to go in. It didn't feel like he was, getting warmed up or so it seemed like Tony Muskett wasn't in the plan.
No, he stood off to the side for the most of it. Like you said, we were watching him with the hawk's eye. We're watching both quarterbacks because I also want to see body language and kind of how they interact on the sidelines. Who are they talking to? It kind of all of that stuff. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. When it gets down to 20-0 at the half, and the previous week you brought in Tony Muskett to give you a spark. I think 20-0 at the half of senior day, your final game at Scott Stadium, needing a win for bowl eligibility. I think that's a great time to try and find a spark. And I know he said, the offensive line play and kind of the surrounding factors, the running back position with all the injuries there, kind of contributed to him not making that switch. But at the end of the day, I'm like, but you at least got to try. Just see what happens. I think, but I think Tony Elliott, and this is something that maybe people don't realize. This is kind of his MO. This is what he has done going back to his days as an offensive coordinator at Clemson. He sticks with guys through ruts. DJ Uiagalelei. No one had a bigger rut at Clemson than DJ Uiagalelei, and he stuck with him through most of that until they had to make a switch. If you look at last season with Tony Muskett, they were sticking with him. There was no quarterback battle. It was only, is Tony Muskett healthy enough? Oh, he is healthy? All right, then we're going to put him in the game. Even with Anthony Calandria having, a good game or something like that. And then coming into this year, Calandria had won the starting job, and that's basically what happened. Like, he stuck with Anthony Calandria, and that's what he was going to do.
Yeah, I think there has to be some evaluation though going into this game against Virginia Tech. Honestly, it should have. If only there was another bye week for Virginia, since
that's what they need the most. Yeah,
they need more a bye week. One, to get everybody healthy, like Kolby Pace. Obviously, they're going to miss Xavier Brown, which is a huge loss against Virginia Tech, one of their best playmakers on offense. But just get healthy, but also really look at what Muskett did against Notre Dame, because he did play against the first team. So I think that's something that is often forgotten when you looked at Tony Muskett, but also just try to see how this offense is different, or are you calling it different? I know they always say they're not calling it different, but it seems like it is being called different, or at least the progressions are being gone through differently, because Muskett does get that ball out quicker. And if the offensive line is struggling, that's what you want. And maybe it's just the height difference. I mentioned it with you on your podcast, how with Anthony Calandria being a little shorter, you do have to adapt, move the pocket a little bit, get him to step to the side a little bit so you can see the field better. And when you do that, you do miss time. You do allow the defense to look at what's going on. And if your wide receivers are taking a while to separate or for that play to develop, I mean, that's all that's been going on for Virginia, especially when they faced the Preston. Man, I mean, that's been the biggest issue for them. Not only the pressure from the line, is that the plays take so long to develop because of that extra 2 or 3 steps. So maybe Tony Muskett would help in that situation.
And we've seen when he comes in, and I know sometimes it's against second stringers or whatever, but against Notre Dame, like, he comes in, he takes his 1, 2, 3-step drop and he fires the ball out. Like, he's processing the offense better at this point. And like you said, we don't know, how much different it is, what the play calling that they're doing when Tony Muskett comes in, but it just seems like he has a better feel for it. And I think if they are willing to kind of go more last year when they had Calandria in there and just kind of let him, the organized chaos to a certain extent and just kind of play that style of football, then that's great. But obviously, what they want to do this year is they want more of a not necessarily game manager, but kind of a distributor. They want someone to manage the run game because they've made great strides in the run game. They want someone that can, find the different weapons out on the side without having to take the big shot downfield or take the risky shot downfield. And then if they need it, just someone to kind of take off and run and create some yards. Guess what? Tony Muskett checks all those boxes. And that's why I think it's interesting they haven't made that move yet. But I fully expect Tony Elliott to stick with Anthony Calandra. And you kind of hope that, maybe they change some things offensively to help him. I'm just confused why we didn't see any of those changes last week.
I'm confused of why we haven't seen those changes after a bye week. Granted, they did win at Pitt, but
Yeah.
when you look at the game against Pitt, the two key factors in that win was one, Xavier Brown. Xavier Brown was able to run the ball against Pitt, and that was what allowed them to do that. They will not have Xavier Brown against Virginia Tech. And they took so long to give the ball to Xavier Brown this season, where he was primarily the ball carrier, or at least start the game to give him that extra spark and flash. And then against Pitt, you had this man called Jonas Sanker who said, you know what, I'm going to take over for the next 5 minutes and do plays in special teams and defense. So even though they point against the game against Pitt, it was a lot of different factors, but it wasn't the passing game. So now you take away Xavier Brown coming into this game, you do need to adapt a little bit, because you're going to have, if Kolby Pace is not ready to go, two inexperienced running backs who aren't going to be great at pass protection with Noah Vaughn and Dante Hawthorne. So you're going to have some issues there, especially with Sage Ennis hurt earlier. He was one of their best run blockers. So you're missing all these pass protections. So it's going to be a question for them. Do you have no, that's not do you, it's like you have to figure out a different option. Maybe try to figure out a different way to use Chris Tyree, who has been underwhelming this year. I know he's been injured, but it feels like they haven't utilized him in a different way. And you see, even your cat has said, like, I need to be in this conversation, because I feel like they do need to make a change.
Yeah, a lot of people in the conversation. But yeah, I like Noah Vaughn. I like what he did last week against SMU. 10 carries, 44 yards. I think he's got enough wiggle kind of in the hole that he can kind of get you those yards, similar to Xavier Brown, maybe just not the burst and athleticism of a Xavier Brown. So I think you're good there. But the problem is, if you don't have Kolby Pace, then you don't have that kind of change of pace. You don't have that other option to go to. And so you're going to wear down Noah Vaughn pretty quickly for a guy that has not played a ton of snaps this year. And so that's kind of what I worry about there. Receiver, you're hoping that you get some good news that, Trell Harris warmed up against SMU, and usually that's a precursor for Tony Elliott. Like I mentioned to you, Tony Elliott likes to have guys come back, warm up for a game, just go through warm-ups, kind of get a feel for it, and then maybe come back the next week. Trell Harris, he's only at 3 games played right now because he got injured after the Maryland game. And so he has one more game to play before burning that red shirt. So if he can play, you'd like to see him out there, at least for a couple routes, just to see if he can kind of take the top off this Virginia Tech defense.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, even if he plays against Virginia Tech, he can still play in the bowl game if they win, because that doesn't count. Those 4 games doesn't count for that bowl game. So obviously, if Trell Harris is back, that opens up a different level of conversation, since the offense was different with Trell Harris on the offense. Now, the other part is you've heard me rant about this. The offensive line, it gets scapegoated nearly every week when it comes to saying, oh, Anthony Calandra is getting a lot of pressure. And to be fair, against SMU, he was being pressured a lot. But when you looked at Pro Football Focus and you looked at the game, Noah Josie and Brian Stevens had a very solid game. Noah Josie was one of the best graded run blockers for Virginia. And that's been pretty consistent throughout the year for UVA. And one thing that you've discussed when we were at the press box was how they count sacks this year, because of the way, if you're running out of bounds and he gets touched, that's a sack. So it's kind of hard to really grade the sack numbers because of that too. And also the other part with when you're grading the offensive line is that with Calandra running and scrambling, he runs away from his blockers. And then the O-line has to adjust of where he is. So it's really hard to kind of judge. I do agree that, there are some parts of the O-line that was struggling against SMU, but they've been actually pretty, consistently okay this season. I think there was other aspects of the breakthrough. So, but overall, the offense, I'm just going to throw some stats here overall for the offense. They are 103rd in the country out of 134 teams with 23.2 points a game this year. Rushing yards, 92nd in the country for 135 yards. For passing, 234 yards, 59th. And interceptions thrown, they're 106th in the country, and sacks allowed, they're 131st in the country. For year 3, that's not great.
Yeah. I'm on a huge stat crusade right now, and I might have to take it into the offseason to kind of figure this out. One of the things with the sacks this year for this Virginia offensive line is, like you mentioned, Anthony Colandrea kind of running around. And I think back to the one play late in the game on that touchdown drive for Virginia. Noah Vaughn's open in the flat, and Anthony Colandrea kind of pump fakes towards him and then runs back around away from his blockers and then ends up with a sack and a fumble. That's not on the offensive line. Like, you had an open guy, you have to throw the football right then and there. You can't wait. And then, what happens is you invite that pressure in to come in and you get a sack. So I think there's a lot. There's, I would say, 3 or 4 sacks that I think were clearly on the offensive line where they just kind of got bum rushed up the middle, didn't pick up the blitz well. And there you go. There's a sack. So I think there is some blame to share there, but it was really interesting hearing Tony Elliott kind of focus a lot more on the pressure that was coming at the quarterback, because all season long he's been very defensive of the offensive line, saying, how much improved their offensive line play is. And I agree. I think that interior of the UVA offensive line is some of the best that they've had since Olu Oluwatimi was on the offensive line anchoring it, just with Brian Stevens and Noah Josie. And then, whoever you throw there at guard between Ugana Nana and Ty Furnish. The tackle play is what has me concerned at times. And usually those guys give up more sacks because, you're dealing with the best pass rusher on the other team. But even I thought Mikhail Boley did well against the Boston College pass rusher, who I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his name off the top of my head, Donovan. But Blake Steen, I think, has struggled at times this year. But I think the interior offensive line has been really good this year. And again, I know it's 24 sacks for Anthony Colandrea in the last 4 games, but some of those are on him. And I think that's just the honest truth.
Yeah, I think I just from reading our message boards, I don't know about how the Sabres handling this. Just by reading the message boards, the answer from Tony Elliott on Tuesday didn't really go over very well. Talking about the pressure and kind of singling that out rather than talking about Calandrea's performance. And I get it. I mean, I think there was one thing I still remember when I covered the Gators with Dan Mullen as the head coach. He's coached Team Tebow and all those guys. The one thing he always said is young quarterbacks, you have to be a little more careful about it, especially younger guys. But at the same time, that is a big question for the staff when you're 1 win away from bowl eligibility after starting the season 4-1 and, only, getting 1 win after that good start. It's something where fans are struggling to swallow that and they just want to see changes. So it'll be interesting to see if they do that going into the Virginia Tech game. And I'm going to have Kolby Crawford talking about the Hokies here in the second half. But Preston, how big is this game? I know every time we talk about, it's the rivalry game, it's huge. But for this Tony Elliott staff, this is a very big game to see where this program is headed.
Yeah, I just wrote about it for the Sabre.com based off of, Tony Elliott kind of quickly flipping the page in his press conference, saying his post-game message was like, how important this game is, not just to this team or to him, but to everyone around in the community. And I kind of talked about, well, a win and you get to 6-6, you have a win over your rival, and almost all is forgotten. Like, you could forgive a lot of things that happened if you get to 6-6, you go back to a bowl game and you finally beat Virginia Tech and Blacksburg for the first time in 26 years. You lose and you go into an offseason with a lot of questions about your staff, just based off some of the performances this year, questions about your personnel, your players, your quarterback, or even worse than that, even worse than questions is apathy. It's just complete apathy from the fan base. I mean, we've already seen they had the second lowest fan turnout for that SMU game that they had all season. It's fan interest is dwindling. And you kind of need something to reinvigorate them, just like that Pitt win a couple weeks ago. It kind of, people were out after that UNC game, but then you kind of started reeling them back in with the win at Pitt, over another ranked team. But after back-to-back games against Notre Dame and SMU, people are like, I don't know, maybe this is it. But I think it's massive for the program's future just as much as it's massive for and important for the program's current times.
Yeah, and just leading into the Virginia Tech game, when you're like, we spent most of this portion of the show talking about the quarterback issue and the offense, and hardly touching on what the defensive staff had done, considering all the injuries that group has gone through, and some of the young guys that we've been able to see on the defensive front. Like even Billy Kudelka had a decent game against the number 13 team in the country. Freshman walk-on, former lacrosse player, came in because they had so many injuries, and I think that's one thing that this staff, I feel like, it's hard for them because they've been trying to tout that they're a developmental program. So when the focus, especially on recruiting, this is something that for the recruiting side of things, they had defensive linemen's visit on official visit and the cornerback and a couple defensive back targets. We're talking about the offensive side when we're not touching on these young guys playing on defense that could help them on recruiting. I mean, they had Ethan Minter, a true freshman, out there because of injuries. They had Billy Kodelka. They had Anthony Britton, a redshirt freshman, going on last year. Jason Hammond as a freshman. Jewett Hayes had a snap. They're missing this opportunity now to help their defense, the defensive recruiting, because the defense has played well against ranked opponents. They kept them in games because of the issues on offense. So I feel like that's the part where not often discussed, but for a team who's trying to win on development, you can't even showcase that development because the other side of the ball is struggling.
Yeah, the defense has really held their own the last couple games, and I know like you see 35 points allowed or 33 points allowed, but really they've been put in some tough situations and they've stepped up. And I heard this point, and I really believe it. I think John Rodzinski and this defensive staff just get the most. Wring every little bit out of the towel that they can to get the most out of the talent that they do have on the defense. Because if you look at the defense, there's one bona fide, surefire all ACC guy on the defense, and that's Jonas Sanker. Outside of that, Cam Robinson, really talented guy, but he's hobbled up right now. Like he could only play on really pass rushing downs and was really limited in that. But if you look at everything else, it's not the most talented unit, but they get every single bit of it out of it. And you look at some of the bad positions they've been put in, and they hold teams to field goals, or even better, they get a turnover and kind of jump and get some momentum. Like that Corey Thomas interception was crazy against SMU. Of course, UVA doesn't do anything with it, and they get no points. But I think the defense is really they maybe not shine, but it's kind of the John Rodzinski model of bend but don't break, and they have kind of lived up to that this year.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when you look at what this defense was able to do, and I mean, I think the attitude of the defense is something that we don't often discuss. I mean, Antonio Clary decided, if I'm gonna be missing the season, I'm just gonna go out the way I want to and play 2 snaps, and it's like, all right, I'm done, and had surgery last week. So that type of mentality. I mean, we saw Cam Robinson's probably a guy that, other guys might not be playing. I mean, I think every part of his body hurts at this point of time. Yeah. He's dealt with upper body injuries, lower body injuries. I mean, I think his quote after a post game is, "They got to take me out in a stretcher for me not to return on the field." And even guys like, Kendron Smith, I think that was an underrated recruit in the portal. Not many people spoke about him. He's a kid from UPenn, transferred in. And look what he was able to do against number 13 SMU. He started off at safety. Then Kempton Shine got hurt and he moved to corner. And he was able to adapt, and he actually was great. It's probably his best graded out performance at his Pro Football Focus. And I think those are the stories that get kind of shaken aside because of this of the stuff that's going on offense. So it'll be interesting to see how everything plays out against Virginia Tech, because at the end of the day, Brent Pry is having an underwhelming season right now. They're both competing in the state of Virginia for recruits. So you've got Brent Pry underachieving and Tony Elliott. Technically, Vegas had UVA at 4.5 games. So that's right on where they expected. But a win against Virginia Tech heading into early signing day on December 4th, and then the portal opening up on the 9th, it could make things interesting in state, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, it's as big as it is for right now. Just getting back to a bowl game and how much excitement that would bring back to the fan base, and just getting a win over your rival for the first time in 26 years in Blacksburg. But just what it would mean for the future, I think it's crucial. It's the biggest game Tony Elliott has coached yet in his career at Virginia. I know he's coached in some national championships before as an offensive coordinator and whatnot, but as far as being at Virginia, I think this is the biggest game, and there's a lot on the line, and you hope that they can kind of come out there and at least perform in a way that shows that they understand the importance of it. Because I think coming into this week, one of the things that was so disappointing is you thought, well, maybe there's an understanding of, we got to get this SMU game because we don't want to go to Blacksburg 5-6, and we want to win one for the seniors. But they didn't really show it. But hey, they've been better on the road under Tony Elliott. I think they're 2-10 in ACC home games under Tony Elliott. But they've come up with some big road wins. The UNC game last year, Pitt this year, the Wake Forest comeback earlier this year. So they've had some good results on the road.
Hey, if they need to, maybe they should have all their games on the road until next year. Then maybe that's what they need. Road warrior
on the road after a bye week.
Yes, on the road after a bye week is the secret to success right now for Virginia. It's going to be a really cold night, Preston, on Saturday. I think it's 19 degrees. I think it's one of our VTScoop writers said that it might be the coldest game between these two teams since 1987.
That is the noise coming out of Blacksburg. Yep.
So fun times. If you guys are venturing over to Blacksburg, I hope you got packed by several layers, some hand warmers, maybe blankets. If you want to bring some for Preston and me, that'll be really apprecited. Maybe some hot chocolate.
Not an open press box like Scott Stadium. So
I know, but that post game, doing a stand up after the post game, it's gonna be pretty chilly. And walking to that media parking afterwards is gonna be very, very chilly, Preston. Before I let you go, I'm going to have to put you on the spot.
Oh boy.
Yeah, I know. Can you do a prediction for Virginia Tech? I know I'm putting you on the spot here.
Luckily, I just did this, so I'm ready. 26 years, haven't won in Blacksburg since 1998. And I've told people all year, don't rely on Virginia to get a win in Blacksburg. But I'm going the other way. I'm going 24-20. Virginia gets a win in Blacksburg. It's a one possession game. So we know Brent Pry is 1-12 in one possession games at Virginia Tech. So if they keep it close, I think maybe something happens and something slides their way. So I'm gonna do it. I don't have a ton of reasoning behind it, so don't take it to heart. If you're looking at that money line, it's Tech's a 7.5-point favorite. Don't take my money to the bank and cash that bet.
Hey, didn't you pick UVA over Pitt?
I picked them over Pitt, and it was kind of a similar feeling. So we'll see if lightning strikes twice, as it has in Blacksburg before.
And if they do, you're picking my lottery numbers next time too.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Yeah. Because
No pressure.
No pressure. For those, I will give my prediction later on this week. They were actually recording this on Monday because of Thanksgiving weekend. So the podcast is going to be out a little bit earlier. So if that's why we're not updating with all the Tony Elliott depth stuff, because Tony Elliott speaks on Tuesday and I'm releasing this on Tuesday morning. So it's a little different this week. So we don't have all that stuff. Will be on Wahoo's 24/7. But I don't think I'm as brave as Preston in this game. I think if Xavier Brown were not hurt, I probably would be a little bit more brave because I think Xavier Brown could be the difference. When I look at Virginia Tech, their defense hasn't been great when you look at it. I mean, their pass rush, that's the main worry I have. I thought, if you had Xavier Brown there, it probably opened up a little bit more. But was that without Xavier Brown? I just don't see it when you look at that defense. But I mean, they've got some of their own offensive issues, and Kolby Crawford's going to talk about their quarterback question. They have their own. I mean, I don't know who's going to be stepping up under center.
Could be any of three guys. Yeah.
Could be any of three guys. Apparently Drones is like 40%, 50% healthy. I mean, who's going to be there? I mean, it's a lot of questions for Virginia Tech. So this is not an easy game regardless. So, well, Preston, thank you so much for joining us to talk a little bit about the Who's.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Jackie.
And just like I mentioned, Kolby Crawford from VTScoop will be joining us just after the break. So we'll just take that quick break now and we'll see you on the other side. we're back to the Good Ole Podcast. I'm Jackie Fincherly for Wahoo's 24/7. And like I said before the break, we're going to continue our preview to the big rivalry game this Saturday. And we bring in VTScoop's Kolby Crawford, the guy who does pretty much a little bit of everything over at VTScoop. Kolby, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, I appreciate the invite. Looking forward to talking some ball ahead of the Commonwealth Clash. So, yeah, let's get into it.
You know, if you would have told me that coming into this Saturday's game, that both teams were going to be fighting for bowl eligibility, I thought you might have been a little crazy. I thought, I looking into this season, I didn't foresee this type of situation, but this is where we are. Both teams are coming in 5. They need that one win to guarantee bowl eligibility. What's the vibe like at Virginia Tech right now?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, not great. When you turn on early shows and like national shows heading into the season, you see Pat McAfee right before on the first college game day picking to win the ACC. A lot of people thinking they can compete for the ACC, picked pretty high in the preseason media poll. And then you fall where you are right now at 5-6, heading back against UVA, like they have numerous years now in a row, where they're fighting to get to 6-6 and get to a bowl. And when this team, I forget what the line was opened at. I think it was 8.5 was the line set for wins. And I mean, when you come well short of that, you return 20 starters, so much returning talent coming off a pretty solid year. It is very disappointing. Year 3 of Brent Pry, and I mean, there hasn't been much with this group. So a lot of pressure being put from fans, different donors, players, coaches. I mean, winning fixes everything. And when you lose and you come in with high expectations, it's really tough. So like you said, we didn't expect it. And I don't think anyone in Blacksburg expected to come into this game 6-6. But at the end of the day, we talked to Dorian Strong, a senior, after the Duke game, and obviously disappointed, but he said you're not guaranteed pretty much anything in this game. You have one more, and you have to go play your heart out for that one to try and secure one more. So I think the locker room's still in it, and it's hard not to get up for the UVA game. Any rivalry game is going to be big, no matter how disappointing the season is. So,
for sure. And plus, there's more on the line for both of these programs. You said the Virginia Tech had a lot of hype coming into this season, and Virginia didn't have as much hype. They were slated to win 4.5 games. They're at 5 right now. They had a couple close games, like the game at Louisville at Scott Stadium, that they probably would like to get back when you think of it. So Virginia it's kind of where most expected, but certainly this game has got a light riding on it for both head coaches, coaches coming around the same time, both trying to build a program in the state. What has been the biggest issue for this Hokies team?
I mean, I think it's really just been finishing down the stretch. When you bring that up, the thing that comes most to mind is the Syracuse game where you're up 21-3 and or in the third quarter, and your defense lets up 18 points there, and you lose on the road in Syracuse. I mean, that game now 3 weeks ago, with including the bye week, would have got you to bowl eligibility already right there. So then that would have got you to 6, and then you have the Duke game probably a little bit fresher, and then you have UVA. So like that still had things on the table. It's just been the inability to sort of adjust out of halftime and finish late down the stretch. The offense, for all that it has been decently consistent, but the defense just hasn't been able to close out games. And I mean, it's really just fundamentals. A lot of it, people like to point to Coach Pry's clock management in certain situations against Miami. The Boston College game, you jump out big 28-0, and then they come out in the third quarter and you blink and it's 28-21. Now they go on to win that game, but when you get spotted 21 points there against Duke, Duke had 2 touchdowns on 4 plays, and it's 14-0 in the first quarter before you can even blink. So there's been issues of slow starts, clock management, lack of adjustments, and then being able to really just make the key plays down the stretch and closing out games. The narrative, obviously, I don't know if you've seen, Coach Fry is now 1-12 in one-score games. He's lost 5 in a row, and they're on an 8-game losing streak overall in his tenure of losing one-score games. So it's just you operate in the margins in this game, and when you let a couple bad bounces go your way, a couple calls, and they just haven't been able to find a way to come away with some of those games.
So when we dive into this particular game, obviously means a lot in the Commonwealth. I mean, I see on my mentions, it's already quite interesting, the convo back and forth between these two teams. They both have a quarterback question coming into this. I know in the first half of the show, we discussed a lot between Anthony Calandri and Tony Muskett, but who is going to be under center for Virginia Tech. I mean, I know they're dealing with injuries themselves. Drones is questionable for this game. Are they going to go to their freshman? Like, what's the latest as of right now? We're recording it on Monday because of Thanksgiving, so we have to record this a little bit earlier. But what's kind of the vibes around Virginia Tech, and what should Virginia expect if there is a slight change at quarterback with certain other guys stepping in?
Yeah, I mean, first off, outside of the quarterback position, this team is very banged up, just like overall. So super dinged up squad coming into this game, but especially at the quarterback position, as you mentioned, Kyron Drones has been very limited as of late. He's been playing hurt pretty much this entire season. He didn't play in the Syracuse contest, didn't play against Duke, played against Clemson, but was very limited. And then that bye week, I mean, he's really struggling right now when you see him just moving around, even off the football field, just with treatment for his foot. He tweaked his knee a little bit because he was sort of overcompensating for the foot. I mean, we'll see. Like you said, it's early in the week with practice. Either way, going into this weekend, he's not going to magically become 100%. You're going to have a very limited Drones if he does go. And obviously that hurts him. He's a big dual threat guy. As you saw in the game last year, opened up so many of those large chunk passing plays because of what he added for the UVA defense to have to defend with his feet. So, I mean, that's going to hurt him there. I think they're going to try to let him go, but, I mean, it's really going to depend this practice because Colin Schley, the backup quarterback who started against Duke and Syracuse, he's been dinged up as well. He got his bell rung a little bit against Syracuse, and then Duke, on the very last play of the first quarter, he came out of the contest with what is supposed to be a concussion, and he spent a very, very long time in the medical tent before going back to the locker room. So, I mean, those things are very questionable. I mean, a week turnaround, I don't know the prospects on him, but outside of him, he was a multi-year starter at Kent State, transferred to UCLA last year. Very serviceable backup, but I don't know his availability for this weekend. I think the plan is to try and get Drones to 50% semi-serviceable because their third option, Pop Watson, the redshirt freshman from Massachusetts, highly touted, I mean, recruit, Massachusetts Gatorade Player of the Year, but he's young. He's about 5'10", smaller guy, probably similar size to Anthony Calandria, but he's very young and inexperienced, had his first collegiate pass attempts against Duke. He's ran the ball and a couple times, but he saw his first real action against Duke, and he played pretty well. I mean, he kept him in that game pretty much all you can expect with 3 quarters worth. You lose by 3 points, but he's young, and when you're going into a game with so much on the line, like you said, to get to a bowl game, I mean, it's kind of a lot to put the first start for Pop Watson, like a redshirt guy, freshman, to sort of step in there and have to play. I mean, if it comes to that, I think he'll be ready. He's a smaller guy, maybe mechanically the best thrower, but he's just small. So if UVA can get pressure on him, get him to the ground, maybe knock him out of the game. He's very quick, though, elusive guy who can scramble, get out of the pocket. Similar to Calandria in that way where they're sort of scrappy, but I mean, Pop Watson's also very quick too. So, you can cut on the Duke tape for him, but I think ideally they're going to try and roll with Drones, not at 100%. And then the next guy will most likely be the redshirt freshman, Pop Watson.
Yeah, it seems like both of these teams are coming in pretty banged up. I mean, Virginia's got several injuries on that defensive front. Obviously they already, missed Jason Hammond for the year earlier in the season. And then you also have Ben Smiley, who's dealing with a head injury. He's day-to-day coming into this week. You have James Jackson, who's out. Cam Robinson is dinged up. So a lot of guys definitely banged up on both teams. Now, you bring up Pop Watson's ability to scramble, but Virginia has a good run game that Virginia needs to contend with Tutton. He's already got over 1,000 yards rushing, I believe, this season. What has he been able to bring to this offense, and what has made him so elusive?
Yeah, Tootin, I mean, just an elite running back, arguably one of the best in the ACC. He hasn't played. I mean, he didn't play against Syracuse, and then he got 4 touches against Clemson, very limited. And then against Duke, I mean, he sort of got back to himself, getting the rock roll and got over 1,000 yards, like you mentioned. But what makes him so dynamic is his ability to yards after contact. He leads the nation, or he's up in the top 10 in breaking tackles. Once you get him, he's so hard to bring down. Had a really good game against UVA last year, took the kick return back, sort of ran up in the hill in Scott Stadium was that moment. But, I mean, really just a dynamic guy. And he's the horse that makes this whole offense go. Especially like we talked about with Drones being limited, big question mark at quarterback. They're going to heavily rely on Bashal to sort of establish everything they do in the passing game off of what he can do on the ground. So really great guy. Haven't seen as much of it this year, catching passes out of the backfield. If they do have to go to Pop Watson, I presume you see a lot more of that sort of dink and dunk, try and get offense through him. He's just an elite playmaker. Being able to make yards where there shouldn't be when you see sort of the blocking ahead of him and the tackles, he always seems to be able to make it for a positive. But like you mentioned, he's been really dinged up too. I mean, missed a couple of those games. He's not 100%, but I think you'll take him at 60, 70, 80%. I mean, really great running back who sort of makes this whole offense go. And then behind him, while he's been limited, Malachi Thomas, the running back they've sort of spelled him with, he still seems to be out. He's been in a boot. It was a freak incident that Coach Fry listed it as before the Clemson game, so he was out. PJ Prelo, their third running back earlier in the year, tore his Achilles. And then they have the other redshirt freshman, Jeremiah Coney, who's sort of his backup now. So at both quarterback and running back, very limited, but Bashal Tutin is on the mend. I expect him to be pretty good to go now with a little bit more rest, and I think you're going to see a heavy dose of him with the limbo quarterback position. So they're going to lean on him to really get things going, and he's a dynamic running back.
Now, before we got into talking about the offense, you discussed a little bit about the issues that Virginia Tech has had, like the Syracuse game where they were allowing, the defense allowed some points and got Syracuse able to come back. They had some defensive struggles against Duke. What has been the main issues on that side of the ball?
I think it's really the back seven. I think the front four has done a really great job of getting after the quarterback and making that some issues, but especially on the ground. I mean, Duke, they held to 20 yards on the ground, but there's certain running back fits between the linebacker play, especially where not picking the right hole or on running and passing plays, it leads to really big chunk play gains. I think this defense would be happy to let you get 3-4 at a time, but it's just teams have been able to get 20, 30, 40 multiple times a game. Duke was able to do it. Syracuse had a couple big plays, and it's usually just a quick blown assignment. One person doesn't communicate, and it just leads to a big hole. So I think they really – just that back seven communication on your assignment and staying to that and not making a 50-50 play when you have no help. That makes me think the cornerbacks, Dorian Strong and Monsoor Delane, two guys who probably will go on to the NFL. I think they'd both tell you maybe they've left definitely some plays out there this year, just over the top. And then the safety play, safeties in the run game and passing game sort of, they're young and inexperienced back there. Jalen Stroman, their guy that they sort of came into the year with, really veteran guy, playing both the boundary or the field side. He got hurt against Vanderbilt, out for the entire year with the broken collarbone. So that's tough when you lose him. And then right now they're rolling with Jalen Jones, who's a converted wide receiver. He's been playing safety for a couple years now. And then Mose Phillips, the sophomore, who he's played pretty well, but, I mean, he's still young and inexperienced. So both those guys back there. And they really have this dynamic true freshman, Quentin Reddish. There was a blocked field goal in the Clemson game that he was able to take back for a touchdown, sort of his first action as a true freshman. But he didn't play a single snap against Duke, dealing with a hamstring injury. So they're thin there. So if UVA, Calandria, or whoever's at quarterback as we get into that, can attack that back seven with some of those chunk plays, the linebackers and sort of the secondary has been able to do that. And if you get past that first level on defense in the run game, you can bust some big plays too. But like you have to get past that front four because Antoine Powell-Riley, second in the nation with 13 sacks. I mean, guys who really get after the quarterback. And I think Calandria felt that last year. So, I mean, there's really positive things, but they've left some overall plays out there.
Virginia has felt that a lot in the last few games for Virginia. It hasn't been a great time for Anthony Calandria as far as allowing sacks in that offense. So that's going to be a tough matchup for UVA against Tech. When you look at this game, I think you even touched it a little bit on the matchup there for Virginia and Virginia Tech is that up front, right? This against, O-line and D-line win in the trenches. But when you look at this matchup, what are you watching for on Saturday?
In the trenches?
Just overall, like when you're looking at this matchup and you're saying these are the keys that I'm looking at as far as that Virginia Tech's concerned, what are you kind of focusing on?
I think Bashal Tutin for sure. You have to get him going to build anything on the offensive side of the ball. I think he has to really just get going and play one of his best games back from injury because if not, I don't think they're really going to open the playbook if it is Pop Watson. And if Drones goes, he's not going to be at his full 100% playmaking ability to sort of affect the game. So really going to rely heavily on him. And with that, you need the offensive line to probably play one of their best games this year because they've definitely struggled quarterback's been on the ground a lot. The holes have been tough in the running game, so they're going to have to step up. So definitely in the trenches, I think if you were touching on there, the trenches are going to be massive in this game on the offensive side, but also on defense. They're going to have to attack the quarterback. Like I think UVA is allowing the second most sacks I saw, or maybe the most in the country. So you have to do that. Have to attack at the point of contact, try to get to the running back early, not let them get to the second level because the linebackers have been sort of iffy. So I think definitely just winning the trench play as is pretty pivotal in a lot of games, but really getting the ground game going and then stopping the explosive plays. I feel like those have really burnt Virginia Tech. If you let UVA bust a couple of those at home in Lane Stadium, it's the first, I mean, it's kind of a side note here. It's the first home game in the Commonwealth Clash for Virginia Tech since 2018 with fans, just because of the crazy circumstances. So I think, albeit going to be freezing cold, maybe a little underwhelming for them, but I think overall it's still going to be a pretty raucous crowd there in Lane.
So when you look at this game and you see these matchups, what's your prediction? It's a close game. It's meant to be, I think it's 7.5 spread to Virginia Tech. What do you envision?
I think Virginia Tech will cover, albeit, I mean, UVA's had their issues protecting the quarterback, and I think Antoine Powell-Ryland and guys like that, Cole Nelson, Keyshawn Burgos, and Neas Peebles will be able to attack the point there. I think Virginia Tech will cover. I don't know score on it. I just think being at home, this team has more talent on its roster overall. I think UVA is ecstatic to be in this place playing for a bowl game with where they were projected. I think you talked about the Louisville game, a couple games they left on the table where they're like, And yeah, I mean, but this is a perfect get back game. I mean, UVA looking at Virginia Tech with that expectations they had and where they are. I mean, it'd be a really big win for them. But I still like Virginia Tech to come away with this one at home, a little bit more overall talent, either who goes at quarterback. So I think Bashal Tootin will be able to sort of carry Virginia Tech, and they'll cover in this one and win.
All right. Well, Kolby, thank you so much for joining us today to kind of talk about Virginia Tech and let us know what's been going on in Blacksburg.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
And thank you, Kolby, for joining us on the show. It's always good to have the other side on the show, even if it is Virginia Tech, just playing. It was always really nice to have Kolby. Kolby's really great at his job and has contributed a lot and has been a great help when it's covering recruiting. So if you actually do like Virginia recruiting, he's a good person to actually follow on Twitter as well. Virginia and Virginia Tech are always recruiting the same athletes. So it's good to have both sides there so that you can have a complete coverage of recruiting. And if you have a Wahoo's 24/7 account, you can read Kolby Crawford's stories as well. So with that, we're going to end the show. We're going to have a lot of content coming on Wahoo's 24/7 leading up to Virginia Tech. So head over to Wahoo's247.com. We also have recruit reactions from the last week's visit. So all that's also available on Wahoo's 24/7. For right now, I hope you guys have a good rest of your week and happy Thanksgiving. Hope all of you have a safe and happy holidays with your family.